So everybody got ready?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Made in Asia panel discussion. I'm Samantha Moon, an industry program manager of BIFAN. Today, I'm thrilled to have Wang Yao from China, Boy Villasanta from the Philippines, Don Saron Kobipanicha from Thailand, Sijit Prabhao from Indonesia, Sylvia Wang from Singapore, Yuko Shiomaki from Japan. So to say a few words about the Made in Asia program, I'm delighted to have Mr. Shincher, who is the festival director of BIFAN and a truly important figure in Korean cinema. And now here's Mr. Shincher.
Can I start speaking?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So hello everyone. So my name is Shin Cho. Actually, I'm a producer. So before the film festival director. So I think I'm not qualified enough to be a festival director. But but now I'm doing doing the job. So that I'm going to do my best, and um, it's very nice to meet you guys. So it's my great pleasure to welcome and see all of you to the 2021 Made in Asia panel discussion of BIFAN, especially during the unprecedented pandemic. Made in Asia was launched in 2016 as one of the main programs of the BIFAN industry gathering. The first initiative was to screen the top 3 films of each Asian country and analyze the audience taste. There was also a conference to build a network to have a solid foundation of the Asian film industry. To collect and archive the figures and statistics, we have published Made in Asia booklets, which include the current trends and tendencies in each country, with the interviews of filmmakers yearly basis. What we are going to discuss this afternoon is about hardships and ideas for upcoming post-pandemic Asian film industry.
Yes. First, we will introduce ourselves with
Yeah,
all together, and then
yeah.
there is 2 questions, and then it goes to round the table session. Yeah, let's break the ice. You're gonna introduce yourself, each of you, and uh, can you start? Can you start introducing yourself, Mr. Wang Yao?
Oh, hello everyone. Okay, just very briefly some numbers because we are focused on the industry, so I think numbers will be really important. So here's something for China, and the money I use, the currency is Chinese yuan, and you divide 7 will be dollars. So in China, we have this 20 billion Chinese yuan box office income, and we become the first place in the world of the box office income. I think it's the first time in the history, and the one significant thing is over 80% is a domestic film, and the top 10 are all domestic film, and we have this kind of 500 million admissions. And here is the chart. You will see that in China, in the past 10 years, the box office income is grows like a liner, but as every country, it has a, how do I say, breakdown in the 2020. And here is the box office income by months. You will see we have like 160, no, 176 days lockdown for the theaters. So it's nothing during the 4 months, and we reopened the cinema since the end of July. Here is the structure of the box office. So you will see that here are 11 bestsellers. So we have the bestseller in 2020 in the world. It's 800. It's a war film, and it got 3 billion. And all all these 10 film are domestic film, and this one is Tenant by Christopher Nolan. So it's 11 film take I think 60% something of the box office income for the whole year. And here is the 800. In China, there's something it's a tradition. Every 100 million Chinese yuan you got, you will have a new poster. So this one, I think is how they had like 31 poster for this record. Here read when it got 200 and no 2.8 billion, it's got the world champion in the box office income. Here is about the production. So we have this number for total and this number for feature films. Also, we have a lot of film companies closed down during 2020. But everything in China, it has a big number. So this 9,800 is not a very big number if you consider the whole Chinese film companies. And here is the screen numbers. It's very strange. It's 2,800 cinemas closed down, but the number of the screens is growing up. Here is other thing. So this film, it's supposed to have the theater release during the Spring Festival in February, but this is the first film, should be in the theaters, but turn to the internet distribution. So this film, I choose the poster. So you will see the poster, it's distributed by TikTok and some TikTok companies, other applications. Here I should mention another thing is a Chinese internet film. It's different with what Netflix do in the Netflix originals. It's made for the internet and it's very low budget, usually something like martial arts and fantasy, action, but very low budget. And this is made for the website. And in 2020, it has a very good opportunity for this kind of film. Some other trends. So there's some re-release of the classical films. For example, with Tenet, we have Inception and Interstellar re-release. And also we have art house film got some chance to distribute in the theaters during the very first months after the cinema reopened in July and August. Traditionally, this kind of film don't have very much good chance, but during the after the pandemic, we reopened the theater and they got the chance to release. And another thing is not only the video websites enter the film production, but also some other kind of internet enterprises, like Didi is a car calling service application, and TikTok is short video. Kuaishou is something similar with TikTok, and Bilibili is something focus on the ACG and fans making video. And Xiaomi is something like Huawei, but it's a mobile phone company. So this kind of this kind of internet enterprise start to making films. It's we should wait what kind of things they're making. And other thing is this is something I missed in my report. If you read my report before this panel, so it's very strange. It's the first time our National Film Ministry announced something focused on a certain film genre. It's science fiction. So it's uh, how do I say? Even Hollywood Reporter and Variety, they wrote articles to discuss why and how the uh, Chinese government want to promote this kind of science fiction films. And about the two questions, so I think
Please, the question will be
later. Okay.
yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So
Okay.
thank
So
you, Wang
much
Yao.
for my part.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then Boy Villasanta, are you ready to talk?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
please make your introduction. And
Okay. My name is Boy Villasanta. I am an entertainment journalist in the Philippines, and I am also a documentary filmmaker. I mean, and of course, if you ask me about the condition of the Philippine movie industry in 2020, of course, during the first 3 months, it was kind of hopeful, no? Because there were movies shown theatrically. But then when the pandemic struck in the mid March of last year, it was really something like a dismal situation for the Philippine movie industry. And if you ask me also if what sector of the Philippine movie industry has been mostly hit by the pandemic, of course, it's the film workers, the ordinary film workers, the cameraman, the makeup artists, or the working, the toiling classes of film workers. And they were really hit by the pandemic. And of course, the stars, big and smalls, were also hit by the pandemic because they were not given, no? There was no job at all, even until the end of 2020, there was no tangible, big productions going on in the Philippines, except for some, because the government has given a go signal in mid 2020 to go ahead with their productions. But of course, they had to observe health protocols like wearing of masks and face shields, and of course physical distancing, applying disinfectant and alcohol and sanitizers, which was really an alien thing for movie stars in the Philippines because and other workers, no, because it was a free for all arena during the pre-pandemic, but in the advent of this coronavirus rage, it was a topsy-turvy. It went really off bounds, and the movie industry was really down. Um, in the middle of the year, there were uh, online screening of films, but of course, online screening in the Philippines is a new thing. So I there was no exact, and there was no exact uh, gross sales of these films because they were exhibited in digital forms, no. And then when the Metro Manila Film Festival, which was really uh, a big hit in the past years, was a dismal flop in 2020 in December. Um, it only earned 30 million pesos. Estimate that was estimate, okay? Because in the Philippines there is no surprisingly there is no official agency which issues official gross receipts of movies, except for one, Star Cinema offers it because Star Cinema is a public company, meaning it trades with the public about stocks in their production and in their filmmaking business. And the other private companies, movie companies, they don't they don't express, they don't issue official
Okay,
official
okay,
receipts of their
okay, boy.
their,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. It's time is done, and so thank you for your introduction. And next, we have Don Saron from Thailand.
Hi everyone. Don Saron Covid Onitcha, or you can call me Don. So most of the time I'm a film producer and I'm also a journalist based in Bangkok, Thailand. So to speak with the situation in Thailand back in 2020 is not so great because we suffer a lot from the pandemic. At the beginning of the year, it seems to be okay, but then all cinemas were ordered to be closed from March until June in 2020. So that was like almost 3 months that there was nothing in cinemas in Thailand. And there's one Thai film called Pochaman the Legacy, directed by Pot Anon, which is a transgender comedy. The film was postponed from the original schedule in April to the 3rd of June, and it earned in the box office only 265,000 US dollar. Because usually for this kind of film, it can make a lot of money, but because of the postpone and because of the pandemic, so the box office is like what I told. And even for last year, we can say that it's the first year since 2006 that there are no Thai film that surpass 100 million baht or 3,200,000 US dollar in the box office. The biggest success for Thai film in the box office is a film called Riem Fighting Angel, which was released around the end of last year, and it earned 2,400,000 US dollar in the box office. Even though this kind of film would expect better box office in normal situation, but for last year, the biggest success in box office for anything in Thailand is Tenet by Christopher Nolan, which earned about 2,324,000 USD. And surprisingly, another big success in the box office in Thailand is the film Demon Slayer, the Japanese anime, which the series is very popular among young people because they watch it from Netflix. So in the box office, it earned 2,300,000 US dollars. And for other films like Mulan and Wonder Woman, it earned around 2 million US dollars. And for company like GDH, which is a company that gain lots of trust from the audience in Thailand, and they make lots of films that make a lot of money in Thailand and also in other countries in Southeast Asia. Last year, GDH only had one film, which is The Con Artist. And the film earned only 1,800,000 US dollar in the box office. So this is the situation last year, which is not so great. And in the box office, you can see that most of the films that earned money last year are Hollywood films, big titles. There are only few Thai films made money last year. among 37 titles, Thai titles released in 2020. Anyway, now we are in 2021. So for this year, the situation is very unpredictable. Just in March, the film Godzilla vs. Kong earned $5 million in the box office, which is very big. This is the biggest box office success, after the pandemic for Thailand. And it makes the cinema think that everything should get better. But in April, now we have a new outbreak in Bangkok and in many cities in Thailand. So now we are under semi-lockdown in Bangkok. Now cinemas were ordered to be closed since 26th of April. And before the cinema were closed, some films were released. For example, the Thai film called Couples in Trouble, which is a comedy film, a family comedy film that aims for family audience, and it earned only $4,480 only. The film was released for less than 1 week, and the producer had to pull the film out of the cinema and reschedule the film in September instead. So this is the problem that everybody is facing now in Thailand.
Okay, thank you, Don. Thank you. And next, Sijit, are you ready? Okay, please. Oh, okay.
Okay, can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Sigit Prabowo from Indonesia. My background is I run the box office Twitter account Bicara Box Office, and I also have a mobile app called Cinepoint, which does box office reporting and audience exit polling in Indonesia. To talk briefly about the sad, sorry state that is 2020, let me begin by saying that Indonesia was on a very good trajectory in terms of box office of box office revenue. We were in the top 20 of top international markets based on MPA reports since 2014. We entered at number 20 and has not since relinquished that position. We're now at number 16, around number 16, 15 all the time. And also in terms of local movies admission has undergone a continuous dramatic rise in admission since 2016. So it's been 5 straight years of continuous growth, a very, very healthy growth. And by healthy, I mean more than 10%, 15% growth. The slowest we had was 2019, but that was considered great because we all know how fierce slate was during that year. So we entered 2020 in a very confident and very ebullient position that is going to be yet another record-breaking year. And in the first couple of months, it turned out to be exactly that way. In the first 8 weeks of 2020, January to February, Indonesian films admission was up 21% year on year compared to the same period in 2019. So we already in that very short amount of time, in its very short period of time, we already got several 3 movies exceeding 1 million admission, which is kind of the gold standard here in Indonesia, the gold standard or a very significant milestone for your movie to be in the cinemas, especially local movies. 3 movies, especially the one that nanti kita cerita tentang hari ini, was released very early in the year, and it scored more than 2 million admissions. So it was a very beginning of a very, very hopeful year. And then followed by other movies, and on the genre front, not doing too shabby as well. Two genre movies, May the Devil Take You 2 by Timo Cahyanto, who is, by the way, going to the Hollywood remake of Train to Busan. And also another horror title, Mangku Jiwo, both very successful and guaranteed sequels, by the way. But then, as in every other parts of the world, the pandemic struck, We had our first case in the first week of March, and then it would quickly conditions deteriorate, and cinemas were officially closed on the, if I remember correctly, on the 23rd of March. And unfortunately, in Indonesia, the condition was really, really bad. And the total amount time of cinema closure was 36 weeks. That's very long, 9 months of complete cinema closure. And even we had a few false starts. We're trying to reopen at the end of July, couldn't do it. At September, couldn't do it as well. The conditions were not really good. And also there's this of a backlash of the public basically condemning movie going experience as something that's very dangerous towards the spread of the virus. So then eventually, the cinema reopening was done in a very quiet and very small-scale fashion in the outskirts of in the smaller cities away from the capital at the end of September. That's very only a few screens and gradually reopening city by city, but at a very, very slow incremental pace. And right now, out of the 2,100 cinema screens in Indonesia, very, very few were open during that time. And the problem as well was that basically there's nothing to show. There's no movie to exhibit. We unfortunately passed the window opportunity to show Mulan, to show Tenet. Then Indonesian movies finally came back to the cinema screen only in December. In early December, there were a total of 6 titles shown, 5 new titles and 1 is reissue. While in the beginning of the year, we managed to sneak about 28 titles into the cinemas. Overall, during the calendar year period from 1st of January until the 31st of December, Indonesian cinema admission only for Indonesian films was down 75%. So it's a huge drop, and imaginably so with the import films as well, because none of the really big titles have yet a chance to make it. In that way, it's a bit of a, actually again, 2020 was a year of great opportunity for us, because the Hollywood slate for 2020 was not as strong as 2019. And we initially had some very, very strong titles down the line for the more lucrative periods of 2020. Unfortunately, it didn't come to pass. And well, you know, just like everybody, we suffered really, really hard because of the lengthy closure. We had one of the worst outbreaks of COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. And so we now had to recover very, very slowly. The first big blockbuster.
Okay, Sijit. Sijit, the time is over, and we can continue to the question. And before that, the Sylvia Wang will introduce about the Singapore film industry. Are you ready, Sylvia?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just unmute myself. Hi, I'm Sylvia Wong, film reporter with Screen International, and I'm also a sales and festival consultant, and I have also produced some films before. And now I'm going to talk about Singapore. Singapore is a fairly small market in Asia. If we look at the pre-COVID times in 2019, just to give you an idea, the Singapore box office was just 140 million USD. And then if we compare it to last year's numbers, Singapore was not spared by the pandemic, and its box office dropped to 37 million USD, which is 71.7% down. And last year, cinemas were closed for almost 4 months from March to July, and it reopened just in time for Peninsula. which was a day-and-day release with South Korea. And the film performed well, and it became the second highest grossing film last year, and also the highest grossing Asian film last year. But its box office, 2.2 million USD, it was just half of the original film, Train to Busan. And that is mostly because of the seating restrictions. When the cinemas first reopened, only 50 people were allowed per hall. And as we all know, Hollywood has always been the dominating force at the local box office. And last year, Hollywood blockbusters were mostly cancelled or pushed back because of the pandemic. Only 2 superhero films made the top 10. And the first place went to Wonder Woman 1984. And the other one was Birds of Prey. And because of the lack of Hollywood blockbusters, Asian films were given more opportunities. And more Asian films entered the top 10. Apart from Peninsula, Japanese anime Demon Slayer made the top 10, and also Hong Kong action thriller Shockwave 2, and local comedy drama Damn Damn Era. So these were all Asian films from the top 10, and compared to the year before, there were more. And Damn Damn Era was only one of 3 local productions released in 2020. And the other 2 were music comedy drama Number One, directed by Ong Guo-sin, and this film received 2 nominations at the Golden Horse Awards, including Best Actor for Mark Lee. And the third film on release last year was Tan Tian's Tiong Bahru Social Club, and this is a social black comedy premiere in Busan before it came back to Singapore as the opening film of the Singapore International Film Festival, and then it went on to have a release in local cinemas. Can we look at the chart, Mark? Right. So if you look at the chart here, you can see the top 10 titles here. And also on top, you will see the 5 top grossing films of all time in Singapore. And all of them are like superhero films from Hollywood. And then the only 3 local films released last year were also there. Number One, Damn Damn Era, and Tiong Bahru Social Club. And below, those are the festival films from Singapore Film Festival, but they did not have a theatrical release yet. And then you can see the box office number. Last year, 49.65 million Singapore dollars, which is like I mentioned earlier, is like much less, 37 million USD. And going forward, 2021 will continue to be challenging because the pandemic is still unpredictable. Singapore, compared to most countries, I can say it has controlled the situation pretty well, but there was quite a serious outbreak recently in late April. And so now the seating capacity has gone back to become tighter again.
Okay.
I think that's all.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. And last, Yuko, are you ready?
Yeah. Do I have 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay. Hi, Mar. Hello, everyone. My name is Yuko Shiramaki. I'm a producer, film sales, buyer. Basically, I do everything for small independent films. So I would like to share what happened in 2020 during pandemic. Japan had a it's not a lockdown actually, but we call it state of emergency, and it happened 3 times during the year. First one, they closed all the movie theaters last March until the end of May for about 2 months. And then February this year, and right now we are under the status emergency again, even for the Golden Week holiday season, which is the best box office season in Japan. So, however, well, until the end of May, which is the first sort of lockdown last year, the box office and admission of the total movie industry went down for like more than 90% because everything was closed. But very, very small theater in the local rural area was opening. So the small number of box office was earned by those movie theaters. But in the end, in 2020, the total box office was minus 45% compared to the 2019, the previous year, which is the worst number in history in Japanese film industry. However, last year, during the pandemic, like everybody was saying, Demon Slayer, one of the uh, top popular, the best popular anime in Japan, they earned 400 million US dollar box office, which is number one in the history. So it is very contradictional that we have the lowest total box office, but that we had the highest one film. So it's really strange. And to my feeling, not seeing the number, to my feeling as an audience in the movie theater, the appetite for the movie is not dying at all. So people wearing the mask and had a distance, and then they go to the theater after the first lockdown because everybody studied that movie theaters are quiet. We don't talk, we don't eat, we don't drink, just watching straight to the screen and spending 2 hours. It's not the high risk. That's what we figure out. And also, the Movie Theater Association tried to promote the safety of the movie theaters. So, although the government support is very weak, but obviously Japanese movie industry survived very well. And total number of the box office 2020 was 140 billion US dollar, which is minus 45%, as I said. And also the total admission was 106 million people, which is again 45% minus compared to the previous year, 194 million admissions. How and in total, 25 films in during 2020 earned over 10 million US dollar box office, which is to me normal. And it was the first year in 15 years that number of foreign films became more than number of Japanese domestic films. However, only 4 foreign films earned more than 10 million US dollar box office, but 21 compared to 21 Japanese domestic films earned over 10 million. So again, it is very contradictional situation that we have many foreign films released, but only obviously Japanese domestic films is successful during this pandemic. One thing I like to mention, even the moviegoers are not decreasing. Even the movie theaters are decreasing, but the BOD moviegoers, if you say, is very much increasing. So in total, the appetite for the film is expanded, I think. That's my impression of 2020. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have two common questions we want to hear from each participant. The first question is, which sector of film industry in your country has been hurt the most? For the time management, if your speech take longer than 2 minutes, we're gonna mute your mic, okay? So let's start out by hearing from Mr. Shincher. Mr. Shincher, are you ready for the answer?
Yeah, yes, I'm ready.
Yeah.
So, can you hear me? So, um, in Korea, so we heard a lot of situations, bad situations from your countries. In Korea, we have not had a total lockdown last year, but to make a long story short, just like the rest of the world, the Korean film industry total revenue 2020 plummeted 73%. So it was historic number. So as you know, so every part of the world have been experiencing something like that last year, and this year we are experiencing the same thing. So meanwhile, the streaming service enjoyed a historic boom and dominated Korean film market, Korean visual storytelling market. So they 60, almost 60, they have been enjoying 60, almost 60, 60 something percent increase of their subscribers, unique subscribers. So um, um, and the world is expecting third or fourth wave of coronavirus, including variants, new variants, second variants, and third variants from India and England, Britain, and someone is saying something like that in Japan. Okay, we are expecting. We found some new variant in Korea, the southern part of Korea. So that nobody knows what's going on, what will be our future. So that I hope it's gonna be a less the last phase of coronavirus, but God only knows. So I think that the um, Korean film industry must wait until after the pandemic to figure out the damage done to the infrastructure of film business in Korea. After all, because you cannot identify the part and scale of the damage in a war until the end of the war. So we'll see which part of film industry works and which part does not after the pandemic. And the important thing is there is a big change in film industry, visual storytelling industry. So the pandemic accelerated the new currents, new trends for the visual storytelling industry. So that we have to think about it, and we need to redefine the definition of the movie. I'd like to suggest that which is movie and which is drama and which is streaming service or something, some redefinition of the conventional definition of movie. So it's gonna be a big issue. So I think I guess. Okay, so I'm done.
Thank you. And next.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Can you read the PPT?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so about the first question, which part is hurt the most? I think the cinema, because the most important thing is China is the very first country to suffer from the COVID, and we have the lockdown since January, mid-January, and the problem is usually the traditional the most profitable period of time is the during the Chinese Spring Festival. So we lost the whole Spring Festival period. I think it's at least 30% of the whole year income. So the cinema suffers a lot. A lot of tragedies, and even some managers of the cinema killed himself just for the protest. It's really pathetic. And the second question, what government did? I think the most important thing is pandemic control. It's not a film policy, but it's really important to the whole film industry, including filmmaking. I think before June of the 2020, the film shooting is really restricted with a number of the staff in the location something. Based on the pandemic control, the filmmaking and the cinema reopen, and our the whole industry get to start again. And some other things different with Korea. In China, the most huge problem is pirate downloading and pirate streaming online videos. So the one thing is the country, our film ministry had some regulations about the copyright it's it's not production protection. Sorry, I made mistake. Protection. And also the government has some policy about the tax reduce. Usually in the box office there's a 5%. It's called the special fee for the National Film Fund. But the National Film Fund in China is totally different with other countries. It's something ridiculous, but difficult to explain. So if you're interested in this kind of National Film Fund, we can discuss in the round table. And also we have some policy burners, usually by the province and some city governments. They have some favorite for example, for your funding, for your got the shooting license, blah blah blah. This kind of burners. And next thing is a subsidy for the online TV film distribution, because in China, film is not only a business, it's also a kind of a public affair. Government have some fund for the they organize some online film festival. They call this and a TV film festival. They have like 3 months, and on the national, we have a national film channel, and we have some local film channel. They show the film on TV. And the distribution company and the production company got money from this kind of fund. So basically, it's my answer to the 2 questions.
Okay, thank you. And next, Boy.
Well, in the Philippines, it's not only the workers who were affected or are still affected by the coronavirus pandemic, but also the producers, but mostly the workers, as I said, the common workers, the directors, the scriptwriters, makeup artists, the coppers, and the independent filmmakers, especially. But of course, the government comes in. It came in last year, giving aid to these victims of the coronavirus pandemic in the film industry. The government, through the Film Development Council of the Philippines, gave out this so-called project, like it's an acronym, which is DEAR, DEAR, which means Disaster Emergency Assistance and Release. But I think this is just not enough for this hapless workers of the Philippine cinema. And this year, the Bayanihan Act of the government is already processing, it's giving out of 5,000 peso cash incentive to victims of this coronavirus in the film industry, you know. But I think this is also small, you know, considering the high prices of goods in the Philippines. You know, the everyday necessity of these filmmakers are soaring in its prices, you know. And also, the FDCP launched its project called Create B.I.G Films, which provide selective funds for development, production, post-production, and distribution. It has allotted, the government allotted 12.1 million pesos for assistance in different aspects of production, film productions to deserving filmmakers and producers. And of course, until now, we are suffering from this effects of this of pandemic to the film industry, especially the small workers. I myself is considered, I would consider myself as a small-time worker in the industry, an independent filmmaker, and a movie writer at that. But movie writers in the Philippines last year were given assistance also, but minimal assistance from the FTCP. You know, so I hope that we will rise up again from this tragedies, from these trials, and emerge a new Philippine cinema in 2021 and beyond. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And next, Don Saron.
Yes. So for your question, I think all the sections in Thailand are equally suffer from what happened. For example, like for Hollywood companies, that they don't have new films to show, they have very few, and the title that they expected a lot, like Tenet, earned $2,324,000 US and became the second place for the box office in Thailand last year, which is I think they would have expected something more. And for Thai films, there are many films made last. Like I told you, 37 films released last year, but some films box office is very, very low. And the top box office is, like I mentioned earlier, which is Riem Fighting Angel, that earned $2,400,000 US and became the biggest success in box office in Thailand last year. But then, I mean, in the normal situation, the film would have done a lot better. And for the cinemas, like I told you, that they closed for 3 months last year. And after they reopen, they have to follow the measure from the government in social distancing. So they can sell only like 50% or lesser seats from the whole capacity of the cinema. And that's a big problem for them in operating. So they are losing a lot of money. And for the small workers, of course, because here I am going to answer your second question as well, that we don't have any support from the government at all. I mean, except in last year, the government gave compensation money to, but to other profession as well for $100 US, and that's all. There's nothing, no specific support or no specific compensation for the small workers in the film industry.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Sijit?
Okay, let me begin. In Indonesia, obviously, as for which sector is most impacted by this pandemic, is the easy and truthful answer is that everybody's impacted. But again, as with the China, I want to focus on exhibition, because an exhibition here, probably Indonesia has the longest cinema closure, 9 months of total closure, and that's after that a slowly gradual reopening up until now. 5 months or 6 months after reopening, only 70% of screens are back open with limited capacity. Show times are limited, and the ticket had to be discounted as well to entice people to back to the cinemas. So that really is a big problem there. Also, as with everybody else, the small workers in the film industry, in the production, is very affected. The one that work contract based, the light riggers, and the people that do not have a steady income or a long-term career in filmmaker, they in filmmaking, they really suffer from this. And also, like unlike European countries, in Indonesia, as of now, there is still no specific support from the government towards the film industry. However, just at this moment, there's been talks about that initiative, and hopefully by the time this video is released, that incentive package from the government will be available to all parties involved, and eventually, I believe the Kickstarter here is to get exhibition up and running again. We are only starting to recovery with import movies like Godzilla versus Kong and Mortal Kombat, and hopefully this government program will help us to spark cinema going again and have the Indonesian tentpoles returning to the cinemas by the second part of 2021. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Sylvia, you want to say something?
I think all the sectors are affected. Cinema is very obvious. They are affected because they have been closed for almost 4 months. And even when they can reopen, the strict social distancing measures mean that they only sell up to 50 tickets per hall. And then for the distributors, they are also affected. They can't really release the films that they have acquired earlier, and it's very hard for them to plan for the release because the release dates keep changing. And sometimes even after they have scheduled the release, they have started the marketing campaign, and then the date has to change, and then the money will go down the drain. And then when they can't release the films, they can't get the money back, and it will affect their cash flow. And the production sector is equally affected, and only 50 people are allowed on set, and including cast and crew, and only 20 actors are allowed in a single scene. So that means if you want to have a wide shot with more than 20 actors, you have to apply for a special permit, and then you have to shoot it immediately within 10 to 15 minutes, and then after that you have to release the people straight away. And all the actors in a scene, they have to keep the 1 meter apart, and which is also a challenge for the DOP, like how do they craft the angles so that all these people are 1 meter apart. As only 50 people are allowed on set, right? And each department is handicapped, and you have to double the resources. So let's say in the past, you can shoot 6 scenes in a day, and now you can only do maximum 3 scenes because of the lack of manpower. And outdoor filming is another problem because a lot of the stories are set in the pre-COVID days, which means people don't wear masks. But now everybody wears a mask outside, and when you shoot the scenes with these people with the mask in the background, so you may have to change your story, or maybe you have to bring in the extras without a mask. And the government has come up with a lot of different measures to help relieve the situation. There are a couple of content funds for short form content for digital platforms, and there's also a relief fund to support freelancers whose livelihoods are affected. And the government has also waived all the film exhibition and distribution license fees, such as new applications, renewals, and also the classification fees for films.
Thank
That's
you,
all.
Sylvia. And then Yuko.
Okay. Which sector hurt the most in film industry to Japan? As you know, everybody in the industry is still having a hard time. Entertainment is considered as non-emergency lifeline, which is not necessary any sooner during pandemic. So it's hard for everyone. But I can say distributor is suffering a very hard time because like Sylvia said, production as well, but considering the business model of film distribution, distributors are the first risks, you know, uh, acquisition fees, P&A, spending a lot in advance, then we don't know when the government ordered to close the theater. So it is like a Russian roulette for distributors. To me, I'm a distributor as well, and I had like uh, 34 theaters opened on at the end of February last year, and it was a kind of a big hit figure for the first week. Then second week they all closed down all the theaters. So I had to spend big fee and main money acquisition fee, but then no income for that film, and it never comes back to the theater. So it's really hard now. Over 400 films are postponed for another 2 or 3 years. Theatrical booking is very much jammed, so it will continue to have hard time for distributor for coming years, I think. And what are the some the measure for our government is doing to support to revitalize the film industry? They are having variety of film fund or grants, but it changes like every few months. So we have to keep on the website which grant that they are giving us. But doing the accounting and paperwork is so hard. But so few of them are actually getting the grant permitted, I think. It is the grant to cover the one side of the half of the cost actually spent. So you really have to have a cash at your hand anyway to get grant because you have to do the distribution or online event, the kind of things. But during right now, during under the third time lockdown state of emergency, and then government decided to give $2,000 per day to close the theater and also $200 per day for one screen. It doesn't make any help a lot though. Again, there are almost no support for distributors provided for now. Um, because the government support the business directly affected by the pandemic. So film industry and movie associations are claiming to the government to support distributors and production companies as well, but it's not happening yet. There are open grants for online distribution plan that every entertainment section can apply, such as theater play, music concert, lives. But again, it is difficult for film distributors and film production company to apply because it is our usual business to do BOD anyway. So it is not considered as a special idea, special occasion for the pandemic. So basically, they think we are not eligible for the grants. So it's kind of contradiction. By the way, it is not the government support that Netflix provided privately support filmmakers in Japan with their $1 million grant. I guess it was for 10,000 film personnel. So it was served first come, first given. It was, I think, quite good grant. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuko. Yeah, almost panels answered the second questions already, two questions already. And so I want to know, Mr. Shincher, do you want to add something to the second question? What are some of the measures of your government is doing to support and revitalize the film industry?
Okay. Okay. So maybe the situation of every country is the same, I think. So that I have one question to Yuko. So I didn't understand then what Netflix did to the filmmakers. So would you be explain it again, please?
I, I think you can Google and try to find the news. Like Netflix Global announced last year that they allocate $1 million to Netflix Japan to
Really?
be, it's like giveaway money to all the film industry individual personnel. So freelancers, production crews, they can apply first in, first given
Really?
money for $1 million for I saw 10,000 personnel. So everyone
Really?
can get like, let's say $1,000 from
Okay.
Netflix.
So Netflix is doing government work,
No,
government.
no. It
No.
was completely private. It was very
Yes.
nice of
But
them to consider because government support money is coming very slow, but
really?
the
So,
freelancers needed to cash
yeah.
urgently, so
Mm.
they did very quickly. I thought it was
Instead
a
of the government, Netflix is doing something what
yeah.
government is supposed to do.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So
Good job.
In Korea they did not do something like that.
Oh,
In Singapore, do you have something like that? In Indonesia or anywhere else, is Netflix doing something like that in Japan?
No, Indonesia, no.
No. So in Korea, no.
Yeah, a lot of the movies that are supposed to be released in 2020 was eventually switched to sold to Netflix and Hotstar Disney Plus. But no,
Yeah.
no such
Okay. Okay.
very graceful
Yeah, it is. It
gesture
is.
from Netflix.
Yes.
Last year, Netflix acquired more than 100 local titles in
uh,
Singapore. So I guess in a way that is their support to the local industry,
yeah.
although it's not in terms of cash to the
Mm.
freelancers.
So actually, I'm worrying about the second domination of Hollywood power with technology. So we have been fighting against Hallyu dominance in Korea for over 30 years, and we've got over 50% of Korean film market these years. But after the pandemic, so there's gonna be another monopolization of Hollywood power with technology. So it's gonna happen again. I'm worrying about it the most. So it is scary, scary. So I have been devoting my life to fight against the monopolization of the Hollywood films, but it's happening again. So and there was a rumors in Korea also. There was a rumors that the filmmakers the over a mile long line in front of the there was a filmmakers in the Netflix office. So so they're waiting for the meetings. They were waiting for the meetings for production because the in Korea the investment and distribution companies could not afford to invest because they could not recoup the money from the theaters, cinemas. So that uh, only Netflix could afford to invest some money. So that it is going on. So, but it is the uh, is a very critical moment for the some film industry, conventional film industry, I think. So that we have to find uh, another way to another way to making film constantly, and but I could not find a clear solution about it till now. But uh, yeah, so yes, no, nobody is certain of return of the good old days. Good old days. Everything is continuing to change. So, um, so I hope. Let's hope we can come back to the normalcy with vaccination. So we, we will see what we should do after that. So it is very difficult to predict the our future. So what we can do just now is to aware of something happening around us. So that I wish you guys a good luck. So to our film industry all over the world.